Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Vibing History. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the whispers of the past wash over you. Tonight, we journey back to a turbulent era in Tudor England, a time of stark contrast where the seeds of rebellion were sown in the very earth. We're going to uncover a story often overshadowed, a moment when the common people dared to challenge the powerful. If you find yourself immersed in this journey, please consider liking this video, sharing it with a friend, and leaving a comment. It truly helps this channel continue its deep dives into history. Now let the story begin. Imagine, if you will, the beating heart of England in the mid-16th century. A time of tumultuous change, where the old certainties were crumbling under the weight of new ideologies and shifting power. We're talking about the reign of young Edward VI, a king still in his formative years, guided by a council that, in the eyes of many, seemed less interested in the welfare of the common folk and more in their own burgeoning wealth. This, my friends, was Tudor England, a land that, beneath its veneer of emerging modernity, was in many ways a powder keg. And the fuse, as we shall soon see, was remarkably short. Now, when we talk about Tudor England, often our minds drift to the grand palaces, the intricate politics of Henry VIII, or the dramatic intrigues of Elizabeth I. But let's pull back the velvet curtains for a moment and look at the vast majority of the population, those who toiled in the fields, whose lives were dictated by the rhythms of the seasons and the unforgiving whims of the land. For these people, the 1540s were not a golden age, but a period of profound crisis. Picture it, a time when the very foundation of your existence, the land itself, was being wrestled away. The main grievance, the burning ember that ignited the fury, was a practice known as enclosure. Imagine ancient common lands, stretches of pasture where generations of villagers had grazed their animals, gathered firewood, and simply lived their lives. Now, envision wealthy landowners, with newfound legal muscle and a hunger for profit, erecting fences around these very lands. Fences that, with every post driven into the earth, choked off the lifeblood of the peasant community. This wasn't merely an inconvenience. It was an existential threat. Where would the animals graze? How would families feed themselves when their traditional resources were suddenly declared off-limits? The logic was simple, brutally so. The demand for wool was soaring, making sheep farming incredibly profitable. And so, land that had once fed families was now being converted into pasture for these lucrative flocks. Farmers were being forced from their ancestral holdings, their small plots engrossed into larger, more profitable estates. And as if this wasn't enough, the winds of inflation were sweeping across the country, eroding the already meager value of their pence. Unemployment was a constant specter. Rents were climbing to unbearable heights, and wages, if you could even find work, were steadily declining. It was a perfect storm of hardship, a pressure cooker of despair. As one historian so aptly put it, the common folk could scarcely doubt that the state had been taken over by a breed of men whose policy was to rob the poor for the benefit of the rich. Can you feel that sentiment, that simmering resentment, building year after year, harvest after failed harvest? It's crucial to understand that this wasn't an isolated incident. Across England, in these turbulent 1540s, there were sporadic outbreaks of unrest, localized riots, and desperate pleas for justice. But in the county of Norfolk, in the summer of 1549, something different, something far more serious was brewing. Our story truly begins in July of that year, in the small, unassuming market town of Windham, nestled about 10 miles southwest of the bustling city of Norwich. Now, just a month before, there had been a minor tremor of unrest in the nearby town of Attleborough. Fences, once again, the symbols of dispossession, had been torn down. The rioters there, in their act of defiance, actually believed they were acting within the bounds of the law. Why? Because Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, the Lord Protector during young Edward VI's minority, had issued a proclamation against illegal enclosures. A glimmer of hope, perhaps, for the oppressed. Wyndham itself was a vibrant place, especially during its annual feast, which fell on the weekend of July 6th, 1549. Imagine the lively atmosphere, food, drink, and a traditional play performed in honor of St. Thomas Becket. Now, this celebration itself was a subtle act of defiance, for Henry VIII, in his zeal to reshape the church, had decreed in 1538 that Becket's name be struck from the church calendar. But old traditions die hard, especially in the heartland. When the feast concluded and the last echoes of celebration faded, a group of people, emboldened perhaps by the festivities and certainly by their grievances, set off. Their target, the hedges and fences that had become the tangible symbols of their oppression. They journeyed to the villages of Morley Street, Botolph, and Hethersett, their determination fueled by a shared sense of injustice. One of their first targets was a man named Sir John Flowerdew. Now, Flowerdew was a lawyer and a prominent landowner in Hethersett, and he was, to put it mildly, deeply unpopular. He'd played a role in the demolition of Wyndham Abbey during the dissolution of the monasteries, an act that had left a bitter taste in the community. And, perhaps more importantly for our story, he was known for his eagerness to enclose common land. Here's where our narrative takes an intriguing turn, a twist that changes everything. Flowerdew, rather than confronting the angry mob directly, tried a tactic of diversion. He bribed the rioters. He offered the money, not to leave his enclosures alone, but to instead direct their fury towards another target, the enclosures of Robert Kett, in Wyndham itself. A classic maneuver designed to pit one against another, to diffuse the immediate threat. But Flowerdew, in his cunning, misjudged his target. Robert Kett was no ordinary landowner. He was about 57 years old at the time, a successful yeoman farmer, one of the wealthier men in Wyndham, yes, but also a man with deep roots in the community. The Ketts had farmed in Norfolk since the 12th century, a lineage that spoke of stability and connection to the land. Robert had even been prominent in saving the parish church when Wyndham Abbey was demolished, an act that had brought him into direct conflict with Flowerdew in the past. So, when the rioters, following Flowerdew's bribe, descended upon Kett's land, expecting resistance or perhaps another payment, they found something entirely different. Kett listened. He heard their grievances, the cries of injustice, the desperation that had driven them to this point. And in that pivotal moment, something shifted within him. Instead of defending his own property, instead of aligning with his fellow gentry, Robert Kett made a profound choice. He decided to join their cause. Imagine the scene. A man of considerable standing, a respected figure, stepping forward not to quell the rebellion, but to lead it. He helped them tear down his own fences, a symbolic act of solidarity that must have electrified the crowd. Then, he led them back to Hethersett, where they proceeded to systematically dismantle Flowerdew's enclosures. The tables had turned. The diversion had backfired spectacularly. The following day, Tuesday, July 9th, the momentum had truly begun. Kett, now their undisputed leader, guided the growing band of protesters towards Norwich. As they marched, word spread like wildfire. People from neighboring towns and villages, hearing of this audacious new leader, this Robert Kett who had defied his own class, flocked to join their ranks. There's a local tradition, a poignant detail that gives us a glimpse into the spirit of this nascent rebellion. It said that a crucial meeting point for these early rebels was an ancient oak tree on the road between Wyndham and Hethersett. This tree, now known as Kett's Oak, still stands today, preserved by Norfolk County Council, a silent witness to the birth of the movement. It would become a powerful symbol, for later, another oak tree on Mousehold Heath, the site of their main camp, would be christened the Oak of Reformation, a living emblem of their demands for change. Though that particular tree no longer stands, reportedly cut down in the 1960s to make way for a car park, its memory echoes through the centuries. So, Kett and his ever-expanding following camped that night of July 9th at Bowthorpe, just west of Norwich. News of their approach, of course, had already reached the city. A local official, either Nicholas Lestrange, the sheriff of Norfolk and Suffolk, or perhaps the former sheriff, Sir Edmund Wyndham, rode out to meet them. His message was predictable: disperse, go home, cease this unlawful assembly. The rebels' response was equally predictable: a resounding no. The official, lacking the means to enforce his command, retreated back to the relative safety of Norwich. Next, it was the mayor of Norwich himself, Thomas Codd, who ventured out to parley. He met with a similar rejection. The rebels were not to be swayed. They spent the next night camped at Eden Wood before attempting to march directly through Norwich to reach their intended destination, Mousehold Heath, a vast expanse of open land northeast of the city. Permission was, predictably, denied. Undeterred, they simply crossed the river one some at Helsden and spent the night at Drayton. And then, on Friday, July 12th, the rebels finally reached Mousehold Heath. This was a strategic choice, a commanding vantage point overlooking Norwich, England's second-largest city at the time. Here, they established their base, a camp that would become the heart of their rebellion for the next 6.5 weeks. This was no mere temporary encampment. It was a burgeoning community, a hub of defiance that, at its peak, would swell to a size greater than Norwich itself, with its population of around 12,000. They were known simply as the Camp Men, and the rebellion itself, in local parlance, became known as the Camping Time or Commotion Time. Kett, now the undisputed leader of this burgeoning army, set up his headquarters in the ruins of St. Michael's Chapel, a place whose dilapidated walls have since been known as Kett's Castle. Another significant site was Mount Surrey, a house built by the Earl of Surrey on the grounds of the despoiled St. Leonard's Priory. This house, empty since the Earl's execution in 1547, was repurposed to hold Kett's prisoners. The administration of this vast camp was remarkably sophisticated. Kett established a council, comprised of representatives from the various hundreds of Norfolk, and even one from Suffolk. They met beneath the symbolic oak of Reformation, issuing warrants to procure provisions and arms, and even authorized the arrest of gentry members who resisted their demands. The ranks of the camp swelled, not only with disgruntled peasants, but also with workers and artisans from Norwich itself, drawn by the promise of justice and a better future. The city authorities, meanwhile, were in a precarious position. They had sent urgent messengers to London, desperately seeking aid, but in the interim, they continued to negotiate with the rebels. Mayor Thomas Codd, along with former Mayor Thomas Aldrich and the preacher Robert Watson, even accepted Kett's invitation to participate in the rebel council. A fascinating situation, wouldn't you agree? The very officials of the city sitting in council with the very rebels who were threatening it. It was from this camp on Mousehold Heath that the rebels, under Kett's guidance, drew up a list of 29 grievances. This document, signed by Kett, Codd, Aldrich, and the representatives of the hundreds, was then dispatched to Protector Somerset in London. Now, one historian described these grievances as a shopping list of demands, and indeed, they were diverse. But beneath the surface, there was a strong, coherent logic. These articles articulated a clear desire to limit the power of the gentry, to exclude them from the traditional world of the village, to curb the rapid and disruptive economic changes that were uprooting their lives, to prevent the overexploitation of communal resources, and even to reform the values of the clergy. It's worth noting that while the rebels were actively tearing down hedges and filling in ditches, only one of the 29 articles specifically mentioned enclosure. It read, "We pray your grace that where it is enacted for enclosing, that it be not hurtful to such as have enclosed saffron grounds, for they be greatly chargeable to them, and that from henceforth no man shall enclose any more." The exemption for saffron grounds has puzzled historians for centuries. Some suggest it might have been a scribal error, perhaps meaning sovereign grounds, land that was exclusively owned freehold. Others point to the local importance of saffron as an industry, perhaps highlighting a pragmatic concern for a valuable crop. Regardless of the exact interpretation, the overarching demand was clear: the practice of enclosure must cease. But their demands went further. In a truly radical plea for the time, the rebels also asked that all bondmen may be made free, for God made all free, with his precious blood shedding. This wasn't merely a rhetorical flourish. It spoke to a deep-seated grievance against laws like the 1547 Act for the Punishment of Vagabonds, which made it legal to enslave a discharged servant who failed to find new employment within 3 days. It also, quite possibly, called for the manumission of the thousands of Englishmen and women who were still, in essence, serfs, bound to the land and to their lords. They were reminding the authorities that the spirit of freedom, bought by divine sacrifice, should extend to all. Their list of demands also included calls for a reduction in rents, a direct assault on the economic pressures they faced. They sought the punishment of corrupt officials, holding those in power accountable for their misdeeds. And they even called for the replacement of counselors to the king, both clerical and lay, who were enriching themselves at the expense of the state, a thinly veiled but direct criticism of Protector Somerset's own Regency Council. These are not just desperate cries. They were articulated political demands. Moreover, the rebels demonstrated a keen awareness of the religious changes sweeping the nation. They utilized the new prayer book for their open-air services, a testament to their desire for a reformed faith that resonated with their own experiences. And they urged that parish priests who failed to set forth the word of God to their parishioners should be replaced. This was a rebellion with a spiritual dimension, deeply intertwined with the social and economic injustices they faced. The fragile truce between the city of Norwich and the rebel camp came to an abrupt end on July 21st. A messenger from the King's Council, York Herald Bartholomew Butler, arrived from London. He went with city officials to Mousehold Heath, and in a grand, official pronouncement, declared the gathering a rebellion. Then, he offered a pardon. But Kett, standing tall amidst his followers, rejected the offer. His words, firm and unwavering, must have sent a chill down the spines of the royal officials present. He stated he had no need of a pardon because he had committed no treason. In that moment, he effectively declared that he and his followers were acting justly, that their cause was righteous, and that it was the authorities, not they, who were in error. The York Herald, lacking the military force to arrest the rebels, retreated into Norwich with the mayor. The lines were now officially drawn. Kett and his followers were, by royal decree, rebels. The city authorities, left with no other option, shut the city gates and began desperately preparing its defenses. The stage was set. The forgotten fury of Tudor England was about to erupt. The very air of Tudor England, especially by the middle of the 16th century, was thick with discontent. It was a suffocating blanket woven from threads of economic hardship, religious upheaval, and a gnawing sense that the powerful were systematically enriching themselves at the expense of everyone else. The grand pronouncements from London, the shifting doctrines from the pulpits, it all seemed to dance mockingly above the heads of those whose very survival depended on the land beneath their feet. In this simmering cauldron of resentment, the agricultural crisis of the 1540s acted as a potent accelerant. Imagine, for a moment, the vast majority of the population tethered to the soil, their lives dictated by the rhythm of the seasons and the whims of their landlords. When that delicate balance was shattered, when the very ground they tilled was snatched away, the result was not merely hardship, but outright desperation. It's no wonder, then, that across England, small sparks of unrest flickered and then sometimes, quite suddenly, flared into full-blown conflagrations. Of these, the rebellion in Norfolk, the one that would come to bear the name of the most unlikely leader, was by far the most serious, the most enduring, and for a time, the most terrifyingly successful. The core of their grievance, the festering wound that refused to heal, was the enclosure of land. Picture it, generations upon generations of villagers relying on common pastures to graze their few animals, common woodlands for fuel, and common fields for small plots to supplement their meager harvests. These were not luxuries. They were the very sinews of their existence. Then, with the rising demand for wool, a lucrative commodity in a rapidly changing economy, wealthy landowners began to systematically fence off these vital common lands. They evicted tenants, consolidated small holdings, and transformed arable fields into vast sheep runs. The logic was simple, brutally so, for the landowners. Sheep were profitable. People increasingly were not. But for the common folk, this was nothing short of an existential threat. Where would their animals graze now? Where would they gather their firewood? How would they feed their families when their small patches of land were swallowed up? It was a betrayal, a stripping away of ancient rights and traditional ways of life. And as if enclosure wasn't enough, inflation gnawed at their already threadbare purses, unemployment stalked their villages, rents soared, and wages stubbornly declined. Julian Cornwall, a historian who understood the pulse of this era, put it starkly. The peasants could scarcely doubt that the state had been taken over by a breed of men whose policy was to rob the poor for the benefit of the rich. This wasn't mere grumbling. It was a profound sense of injustice, a feeling that the very fabric of society was being deliberately unraveled to serve the avarice of a privileged few. So the stage was set. The mood was volatile, the air thick with the unspoken. All that was needed was a catalyst, a spark in the powder keg. And that spark, ironically enough, arrived not in the form of firebrand agitator, but during a boisterous village feast. Our story, then, truly begins in July of 1549 in the unassuming market town of Windham, nestled about 10 miles southwest of the bustling city of Norwich. The locals referred to it, perhaps with a mixture of fear and excitement, as the commotion time. This wasn't the first sign of trouble. The previous month, in the nearby town of Attleborough, fences erected by a manor lord to enclose common lands had been summarily torn down. What's crucial here, what gives us a window into the mindset of these early rioters, is that they genuinely believed they were acting within the bounds of the law. Edward Seymour, the first Duke of Somerset and the Lord Protector during the young Edward VI minority, had actually issued a proclamation against illegal enclosures. This gave the peasants a perceived legal legitimacy to their actions, a moral high ground from which to challenge the perceived transgressions of the wealthy. The weekend of July 6th, 1549, was Windham's annual feast, a time for community, celebration, and perhaps a bit too much ale. A play in honor of St. Thomas Becket was performed, a defiant act in itself, as Henry VIII had officially decreed in 1538 that Becket's name be purged from the church calendar. These gatherings, these moments of shared cultural identity, often served as incubators for dissent, places where grievances could be openly aired and collective frustration could coalesce. Once the feast concluded on Monday, the merriment gave way to a darker, more purposeful energy. A group of townspeople set out, not for their fields, but for the nearby villages of Morley Street, Botolph, and Hethersett. Their mission was clear: to tear down hedges and fences, to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. One of their initial targets was a man named Sir John Flowerdew, a lawyer and landowner from Hethersett. Flowerdew was deeply unpopular, known for his role in overseeing the demolition of parts of Windham Abbey during the dissolution of the monasteries, an act that still rankled many, and, more immediately, for his relentless enclosure of land. Here's where our unlikely protagonist steps onto the stage. Flowerdew, shrewd and self-serving, chose not to directly confront the angry mob. Instead, he attempted to deflect their fury. He bribed the rioters, an astonishing act of cowardice and manipulation, to leave his own enclosures untouched and, crucially, to direct their destructive energies towards the lands of a certain Robert Kett, who resided in Windham. Robert Kett was, by all accounts, an established and respected figure in his community. Around 57 years old, he was one of the wealthier farmers in Windham, part of a family line that had tilled Norfolk soil since the 12th century. The Ketts, whether spelled Kett, Cat, Chat, or Knight, were deeply rooted in the area. Robert himself was the son of Thomas and Marjorie Kett. While several of his brothers had passed away by 1549, his eldest brother, William, would soon join him in the unfolding rebellion. There's no record of his wife, Alice, or his sons being directly involved, suggesting perhaps they remained in the background of the coming storm. Kett wasn't some firebrand radical. In fact, he had been a prominent voice among the parishioners in their efforts to save their local church when Windham Abbey was demolished, an act that had put him in direct opposition to none other than Sir John Flowerdew. So, there was already a history of friction between these two men, a personal resentment layered over the broader economic and social grievances. When the rioters, undoubtedly fueled by Flowerdew's bribe and perhaps a bit of local rivalry, arrived at Kett's property, they expected resistance. They expected the typical response of a wealthy landowner: defiance, threats, perhaps even violence. But Robert Kett was no typical landowner. Instead of resisting, instead of meeting their anger with his own, Robert Kett listened. He listened to their grievances, to the desperate cries of people whose livelihoods were being systematically destroyed. And in that moment, something shifted within him. Perhaps it was the deep-seated understanding of injustice that resonated with his own past conflicts with Flowerdew. Perhaps it was a genuine empathy for the plight of his less fortunate neighbors. Or perhaps, seeing the sheer force of their collective will, he recognized an opportunity for true change, an opportunity to lead rather than be swept aside. Whatever the precise catalyst, Kett made a monumental decision. He agreed to their demands. More than that, he offered to lead them. He didn't just yield, he embraced their cause. And in an act of extraordinary symbolism, he helped them tear down his own fences. Imagine the scene: a man of wealth, a pillar of the community, actively participating in the very act of rebellion against the system that had benefited him. This wasn't just a pragmatic move, it was a profound declaration of solidarity. From Kett's property, the newly galvanized group, now with a legitimate, respected leader at their head, turned back to Hetherset and proceeded to dismantle Flowerdew's enclosures with a righteous fury. The following day, Tuesday, July 9th, the momentum had truly taken hold. The protesters, no longer a mere mob, but a rapidly growing movement, set off for Norwich. Robert Kett was unequivocally their leader, and with every mile they marched, they were joined by more and more people from the surrounding towns and villages, swelling their ranks. A local tradition, often passed down through generations, claims that the rebels held a significant meeting beneath a grand oak tree on the road between Windham and Hetherset. This tree, now known as Kett's Oak, stands to this day, a preserved monument to the rebellion. It became an enduring symbol of their cause, a powerful image of unity and resistance, a testament to their desire for fundamental change. Later, a similar oak on Mousehold Heath would become the very heart of the rebel camp, affectionately dubbed the Oak of Reformation. Though sadly, that particular tree no longer stands, purportedly cut down by Norwich City Council in the 1960s to make way for a car park, a rather prosaic end for such a potent symbol. As evening fell on July 9th, Kett and his growing legions made camp at Bowthorpe, just west of Norwich. Word of their approach, of course, had already reached the authorities. A local official, either Nicholas Lestrange, the sheriff of Norfolk and Suffolk, or the former sheriff Sir Edmund Windham, rode out to confront them, ordering them to disperse. But the answer he received was a resounding negative. The official, lacking any real force to back his words, retreated hastily back to the perceived safety of Norwich. The following morning, the mayor of Norwich himself, Thomas Codd, ventured out to meet with the rebels, receiving a similarly firm rejection of his pleas. The rebels spent the next night camped at Edenwood. Their intention was clear: to march directly through Norwich to reach Mousehold Heath, a strategically advantageous high ground to the northeast of the city. But permission was refused by the city authorities, who were clearly growing increasingly nervous. Undeterred, the rebels simply changed course, crossing the river one some at Helsden and spending the night at Drayton. This wasn't a retreat, it was a tactical redirection, a demonstration of their growing organization and resolve. Finally, on Friday, July 12th, Kett's forces, now numbering in the thousands, reached Mousehold Heath. This was their chosen ground, a natural fortress overlooking Norwich, the second largest city in England at the time. Here, they established their base, a sprawling camp that would be their home for the next 6.5 momentous weeks. The rebels were known then as the Campmen, and their uprising, the camping time, or commotion time. Kett, ever the pragmatist and strategist, set up his headquarters in the ruins of St. Michael's Chapel, a place now famously known as Kett's Castle. Mount Surrey, a grand house built by the Earl of Surrey on the site of the former St. Leonard's Priory, stood empty since the Earl's execution in 1547. This vacant manor was quickly repurposed, becoming a makeshift prison for those members of the gentry whom Kett's men had captured. But this was no mere rabble camp. Kett's vision and his organizational skills transformed it into a functioning, albeit temporary, society. A council was formed, comprised of representatives from the various hundreds of Norfolk and even one from Suffolk, demonstrating the growing regional scope of the rebellion. This council met beneath the symbolic oak of Reformation, administering the camp, issuing warrants for provisions and arms, and even orchestrating the arrest of gentry members perceived as hostile or corrupt. The camp itself was a marvel of grassroots organization. Workers and artisans from Norwich flocked to join, as did people from surrounding towns and villages. Incredibly, the rebel camp on Mousehold Heath soon swelled to a population larger than Norwich itself, which at the time boasted around 12,000 inhabitants. The Norwich authorities, trapped between a rock and a hard place, dispatched messengers to London, desperately seeking royal intervention. But in the meantime, they continued negotiations with the rebels. In a testament to the respect Kett commanded, Mayor Thomas Codd, former Mayor Thomas Aldrich, and even the preacher Robert Watson, all prominent figures in Norwich, accepted Kett's invitation to participate in his council. This wasn't merely a show of good faith. It was an implicit recognition of the rebels' power and their legitimate grievances. Once the camp was firmly established, the rebels meticulously drew up a list of 29 grievances. This document, a powerful articulation of their collective suffering and their vision for a more just society, was signed by Kett, Codd, Aldrich, and the various representatives from the hundreds. It was then dispatched to Protector Somerset in London, a clear signal that this was not a localized riot, but a broad-based, organized challenge to the status quo. One historian aptly described these grievances as a shopping list of demands. But beneath the surface, they possessed a profound and undeniable logic. They articulated a fervent desire to curb the overwhelming power of the gentry, to reclaim the autonomy of the village community, to resist the relentless march of rapid economic change, to protect communal resources from overexploitation, and fundamentally, to remodel the values of the clergy, whom many felt had become too distant and too complicit with the wealthy. It's fascinating to note that despite the rebels tearing down hedges and filling in ditches with abandon, only one of the 29 articles directly mentioned enclosure. This particular article requested that where it is enacted for enclosing, that it be not hurtful to such as have enclosed saffron grounds, for they be greatly chargeable to them, and that from henceforth no man shall enclose any more. The puzzling exemption for saffron grounds has stumped historians. Some have speculated it might have been a scribal error for sovereign grounds, lands exclusively owned in freehold, while others point to the significant role of saffron in the local industry. This seemingly minor detail highlights the complexities and nuances even within a broadly unified rebellion. Perhaps even more striking was their plea that all bondmen may be made free, for God made all free with his precious blood shedding. This wasn't just a cry for economic justice. It was a powerful theological argument for human liberty. The rebels may have been reacting to the deeply unpopular 1547 Act for the Punishment of Vagabonds, which controversially legalized the enslavement of discharged servants who couldn't find new masters within 3 days. However, their demand may also have been a more fundamental call for the manumission of the thousands of English men and women who were still held as serfs, a vestige of feudalism that lingered stubbornly in pockets of the country. Indeed, the 1549 Act, passed to address vagrancy, shrewdly avoided the term slave but retained many of the harshest provisions of its predecessor, demonstrating the government's unwavering desire to control the labor force. Beyond these core demands, the list also included calls for a reduction in rents, a direct assault on the economic exploitation they faced. They sought the punishment of corrupt officials, an indication of their deep distrust of local governance. And perhaps most boldly, they demanded the replacement of royal counselors, both clerical and lay, who had enriched themselves at the state's expense. A thinly veiled but unmistakable indictment of Protector Somerset's Regency Council itself. This was not a localized grumble. It was a systemic critique of power. Interestingly, despite the religious turmoil of the era, the rebels adopted the new prayer book for their open-air services, a move that would have been seen as progressive and aligned with the official Protestant reforms of the young King Edward VI. They also passionately urged that parish priests who failed to set forth the word of God to their parishioners should be replaced, indicating a desire for a more engaged, less corrupt clergy. For a period, a fragile truce seemed to hold between the city of Norwich and the sprawling rebel camp on Mousehold Heath. But this uneasy calm was shattered on July 21st, when a messenger from the King's Council, York Herald Bartholomew Butler, arrived from London. Accompanied by city officials, he ventured out to Mousehold. There, standing before the assembled rebels, he proclaimed their gathering a rebellion and offered a royal pardon, a standard government tactic to quell unrest. But Robert Kett, ever the defiant figure, rejected the offer outright. He declared, with unwavering conviction, that he had no need of a pardon because he had committed no treason. This was a pivotal moment, a clear declaration that Kett viewed his actions not as rebellion against the crown, but as a righteous struggle for justice within the framework of traditional English law and custom. The York Herald, lacking any military force, was left with no option but to retreat into Norwich with the mayor. Kett and his followers were now officially, unequivocally, rebels in the eyes of the crown. The authorities in Norwich, understanding the gravity of the situation, immediately shut the city gates and began frantically preparing their defenses. The confrontation that had been brewing for weeks was now inevitable. On July 22nd, 1549, Kett, perhaps seeking to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, proposed a truce. But his offer was decisively rejected by the city authorities, who by now were entrenched in their preparations for a siege. With diplomatic avenues exhausted, the rebels launched their attack. Their target, Bishopsgate Bridge, one of the crucial access points into the city. Charging down from Mousehold Heath, the rebels threw themselves into the river Somme, swimming across its waters between the formidable Cow Tower and Bishopsgate. The city defenders, positioned high on the walls, rained down volleys of arrows into the river, desperately trying to halt the advance. But their efforts were in vain. The sheer numbers and determination of the rebels overwhelmed the defenses. Norwich, the second-largest city in England, quickly fell. What followed was remarkable for its discipline. There was no indiscriminate violence, no rampant looting. The rebels, under Kett's firm command, captured guns and other military supplies, but then systematically set up guards at strategic points throughout the city. Order was maintained. The York Herald, who had remained in Norwich, made one last desperate attempt, offering a second royal pardon to the rebels. Again, it was rejected. The Herald, his mission a complete failure, departed for London, leaving England's proud city of Norwich firmly in the hands of a peasant army. Civic leaders were rounded up and taken to Mousehold, imprisoned in Surrey House. However, Mayor Codd, who had previously engaged in negotiations with Kett, was released and chose to remain within the rebel camp, a testament to his complex relationship with both sides of the conflict. His deputy, Augustine Steward, remained in the city, an uncomfortable liaison between the captured city and its new masters. The news of Norwich's fall sent shockwaves through the royal court in London. This was no mere local disturbance. This was a full-blown rebellion that had seized a major urban center. The king, or rather, his protector Somerset, responded by dispatching the Marquis of Northampton with a force of approximately 1,400 men, including a contingent of experienced Italian mercenaries. Their mission, to crush the uprising. As Northampton's army neared the city, he sent his herald ahead, demanding the city's surrender. Deputy Mayor Augustine Steward, after consulting with Mayor Codd, who was still on Mousehold, made the pragmatic decision to open the city gates to Northampton's forces. The rebels, exhibiting a surprising tactical astuteness, had already withdrawn back to the safety of Mousehold Heath, the high ground overlooking the city. Kett, understanding the immense difficulty of defending miles of city walls and gates with a largely untrained army, recognized that it was far more prudent to allow Northampton's relatively small royal army to occupy and defend the city while he, Kett, once again laid siege to it. It was a clever maneuver, turning the tables on the royalists. On the night of July 31st, Northampton's royal army busied itself with defensive preparations, patrolling the narrow, winding streets of Norwich. Around midnight, alarms rang out, jolting Northampton from his sleep. Hundreds of rebels, intimately familiar with the labyrinthine network of small streets and alleys around Tombland, were using the cover of darkness to launch coordinated hit-and-run attacks on the royal troops. For 3 grueling hours, Northampton's men fought to repel the elusive rebels, inflicting heavy casualties, but realizing the ferocity and cunning of their foe. By 8 a.m. the following morning, August 1st, the royal forces had strengthened the ramparts between the Cow Tower and Bishopsgate, creating a more defensible line. Lord Sheffield, a senior commander, retired to the Maid's Head Inn for a well-deserved breakfast. Shortly after, a rumor reached Northampton. The rebels wished to discuss surrender and were gathering near the Pockthorpe Gate. Sheffield, accompanied by the herald, rode out to investigate this seemingly positive turn of events. But it was a ruse. Upon arrival, Sheffield found no rebels at all. It was either a false rumor or, more likely, a clever diversion. For at that very moment, thousands of rebels once again began pouring across the river one Somme, near Bishopsgate, launching a fresh assault on the city. Northampton's main force was positioned in the marketplace. As the attack unfolded, he funneled men through the streets, plunging them into a brutal and escalating street battle that engulfed the entire eastern section of the city. Seeing the tide turning in the rebels' favor, Lord Sheffield took command of a cavalry unit and bravely charged the rebel lines. His charge took him through the cathedral precinct, past St. Martin at Place Church, and into Bishopsgate Street. It was there outside the great hospital that tragedy struck. Sheffield fell from his horse into a ditch. Expecting to be captured and ransomed, a common practice of the time, he removed his helmet. But instead of capture, he was met with a swift, deadly blow from a rebel, reputedly a butcher named Fulk. The loss of a senior commander, coupled with his army being fragmented and decimated in the chaotic street fighting, left Northampton with no choice. He ordered a full retreat. The royal army, humiliated and defeated, fled Norwich, leaving the city once again firmly in the hands of Robert Kett and his peasant forces. It was an astonishing victory, a testament to the rebels' fighting spirit, their knowledge of the terrain, and Kett's tactical leadership. The Crown, now deeply alarmed, sent a much larger and more formidable force. This time, it was led by the Earl of Warwick, a seasoned military commander with extensive experience in France, a former member of the House of Commons, and a Privy Council member. Warwick's army numbered around 14,000 men, a truly massive force, and included mercenaries from Wales, Germany, and Spain. This was an army built to crush rebellions. Despite this overwhelming new threat, the rebels remained fiercely loyal to Kett. They continued to fight Warwick's professional soldiers with surprising tenacity. Northampton, chastened by his earlier defeat, served as Warwick's second-in-command in this second, far more serious attempt to retake Norwich. Warwick's army finally managed to breach the city on August 24th, attacking both the St. Stephen's and Brazen Gates simultaneously. The rebels, facing superior numbers and training, were forced to retreat through the city. As they pulled back, they set fire to houses, creating a chaotic blaze that sought to slow the royal army's advance and deny them a foothold. Around 3 p.m., Warwick's baggage train, carrying all the vital supplies and, crucially, the artillery, entered the city. But in the chaos, it became lost. Instead of proceeding to the designated marketplace, it inadvertently continued through Tombland and straight down Bishopsgate Street, directly towards the rebel army. From their vantage point on Mousehold, a group of rebels spotted the vulnerable baggage train. Seeing their opportunity, they surged down into the city, attempting to capture it. Captain Drury, a royal officer, led his men in a desperate counterattack to recapture the train and its precious artillery. Another fierce fight erupted around Bishopsgate, a brutal struggle for control of the essential supplies. On August 25th, the rebels, refusing to yield, launched an artillery attack of their own, bombarding the city walls around the northern areas, near the Magdalen and Pockthorpe gates. With the northern part of the city once again in rebel hands, Warwick unleashed a full-scale assault. Bitter street fighting raged through Norwich for another day, eventually clearing the city once more, but at a heavy cost to both sides. The rebels, though outmatched, were clearly not easily broken. The decisive moment came on August 26th. 1,400 foreign mercenaries, German Landsknechts, a formidable mix of handgunners and pikemen, arrived in Norwich. With these reinforcements, Warwick now commanded an army of truly overwhelming power. Kett and his followers, acutely aware of the impossibility of holding the city against such a force, made a fateful decision. That night, they abandoned their camp at Mousehold Heath, descending to lower ground in preparation for a direct, open battle. It was a desperate gamble, a last stand against the might of the crown. The morning of August 27th saw the two armies arrayed against each other outside the city. The final, brutal confrontation took place at a location known as Dussindale. In the open, without the tactical advantages of the city streets or the high ground of Mousehold, Kett's largely untrained rebel army was utterly exposed to Warwick's well-armed and highly disciplined troops. The battle was a disaster. The rebels were routed, their dreams of justice shattered on the battlefield. Thousands were slaughtered, their bodies littering the landscape. The precise location of Dussindale has been a subject of historical debate for centuries. Battlefield debris, primarily musket balls and other lead shot, iron artifacts like arrowheads rarely survive the passage of time, have suggested a location known as Long Valley, now a partially built-up area northeast of Norwich City Center. However, in Carter of Norfolk Archaeology, poring over parish records, propose an alternative site further to the east, citing references to Dussingsdale, adjacent to the common of Great Plumstead Village. A map regression analysis published by the Council for British Archaeology has since supported Carter's proposition, pinpointing the exact spot approximately 200 meters to the west of her initial suggestion. But regardless of the exact coordinates, the outcome was devastatingly clear. Around 3,000 rebels are believed to have perished at Dussindale, a chilling testament to the brutality of the engagement. Warwick's army, though victorious, also suffered significant losses, with approximately 250 men killed. The morning after the battle, August 28th, the full, grim reality of defeat became apparent. Rebels were summarily hanged, their bodies displayed as a gruesome warning. The executions took place at the very Oak of Reformation, the symbolic heart of their rebellion, and outside the Magdalen Gate. Estimates of the number of executed vary wildly, from 30 to a horrifying 300. Warwick, in his relentless pursuit of crushing dissent, had already executed 49 rebels when he first entered Norwich just days before. It's worth noting, in contrast, that there is only one attested incident in which the rebels had killed in cold blood. One of Northampton's Italian mercenaries, who had been captured, was hanged by Kett's men. Robert Kett himself was captured the night after the battle at the village of Swannington. He was taken, along with his brother William, to the imposing Tower of London to await trial for treason. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. Found guilty, the brothers were returned to Norwich at the beginning of December. On December 7th, 1549, Robert Kett was hanged from the walls of Norwich Castle, his defiant gaze, in death, still overlooking the city he had briefly commanded. On the same day, his brother William was hanged from the west tower of Windham Abbey, a stark and brutal message to any who might dare to challenge the crown again. In the immediate aftermath, the Norwich authorities moved swiftly to erase the memory of the rebellion. In 1550, they decreed that August 27th, the day of the rebels' crushing defeat, would forever be a holiday commemorating the deliverance of the city from Kett's rebellion. Lectures were funded in the cathedral and parish churches, extolling the virtues of obedience and condemning the sins of rebellion. This tradition, a deliberate act of historical revisionism, continued for over a century, ensuring that Kett was remembered as a traitor, a dangerous instigator of chaos. The earliest accounts of the rebellion, such as Sir John Cheek's The Hurt of Sedition, How Gruesome It Is to a Commune Wealth, 1549, and Nicholas Southerton's eyewitness manuscript, were predictably hostile, portraying the rebels as violent, misguided rabble. Alexander Neville's 1575 Latin history, De Furoribus Norfolciensium, echoed this sentiment. Neville, notably, was secretary to Matthew Parker, who had preached to Kett's followers under the yoke of Reformation, attempting, unsuccessfully, to persuade them to disperse. Neville's work, translated into English in 1615 as Norfolk Furies, was reprinted throughout the next century, solidifying the official narrative. Even Francis Blomfield's detailed History of Norwich, 1741 to 1742, though allowing for a degree of impartiality in setting out the rebels' grievances, ultimately heaped abuse upon them for daring to go beyond their original intentions. For centuries, Robert Kett was remembered as a traitor, a symbol of dangerous civil unrest. His rebellion was a scar on the historical landscape, a warning against challenging established authority. But history, like the tides, eventually turns. It wasn't until the 19th century that more sympathetic portrayals of the rebellion began to emerge. An anonymous work in 1843 criticized Neville's biased account. Then, in 1859, a clergyman named Frederick Russell, after unearthing new archival material, reached a groundbreaking conclusion. Though Kett is commonly considered a rebel, yet the cause he advocated is so just that one cannot but feel he deserved a better name and a better fate. This was the beginning of Kett's transformation from traitor to folk hero, a slow but steady reclaiming of his legacy. The 20th century saw this transformation accelerate. In 1948, Alderman Fred Henderson, a former mayor of Norwich who had himself been imprisoned in the castle for his role in the food riots of 1885, proposed a memorial to Kett. Initially hoping for a statue, he settled for a plaque, engraved with his own words, unveiled in 1949, precisely 400 years after the rebellion. This act of public commemoration cemented Kett's place as a figure of historical significance, not just local lore. In the 21st century, the memory of Kett continues to resonate. On December 7th, the anniversary of his death, memorial marches, often led by groups like Norwich Occupy and the Norwich Green Party, take place, with wreaths laid by the gates of Norwich Castle. This ongoing commemoration underscores the enduring relevance of Kett's struggle, a reminder that the fight for economic justice and the right to challenge oppressive power remains a potent force. In the immediate aftermath of the rebellion, the lands of Robert Kett and his brother William were, of course, forfeited to the crown, a common punishment for treason. However, some of these lands were later restored to one of his sons, indicating perhaps a slight softening of the crown's stance, or simply the complexities of property law. In the longer term, the Kett family, surprisingly, did not seem to suffer lasting detriment from their association with the rebellion. Indeed, they prospered in various parts of Norfolk, their name not entirely extinguished. Today, Robert Kett's legacy is woven into the very fabric of the region he sought to change. Schools, streets, pubs, and even a walking route in the Norwich and Windham area bear his name or that of the rebellion. The Robert Kett Junior School in Windham, Dussindale Primary School in Norwich, the Robert Kett Pub, Kett House residence at the University of East Anglia, Kett's Tavern in Norwich. A folk band, Lewis Garland and Kett's Rebellion, and a local beer, Woodford's Brewery's Kett's Rebellion, further keep his memory alive. His story has inspired numerous works of fiction, including novels like Frederick H. Moore's Mistress Hazelwood, A Tale of the Reformation Oak, 1876, Jack Lindsay's The Great Oak, 1949, and the acclaimed C.J. Sansom's Tombland, 2018. Plays, poetry, and even British composer Malcolm Arnold's Robert Kett Overture, Opus 141. In 1988, all attest to the enduring power of his story, a tale of ordinary people driven to extraordinary lengths by an undeniable thirst for justice. Robert Kett, the reluctant revolutionary, the yeoman farmer who chose to lead rather than resist, left an indelible mark on English history. His rebellion, born of desperation and fueled by a profound sense of injustice, ultimately failed in its immediate goals, crushed by the overwhelming might of the state. But its echoes, the grievances it voiced, and the courage it displayed, reverberate still, a powerful reminder of a time when the common people rose up, not for glory, but for survival, for dignity, and for a more just world. And in that, his legacy endures. The rebellion, now a surging river of discontent, continued its inexorable flow. From the small market town of Windham, the growing multitude, under the improbable leadership of Robert Kett, made its way toward Norwich, a city that, at this time, was England's second largest. The journey itself was a testament to the rebels' conviction, a steady advance fueled by grievances that had festered for generations. Kett, now indisputably their leader, proved to be more than just a man who had torn down his own fences. He was an organizer, a strategist, and a figure who could command the loyalty of thousands. As they marched, their ranks swelled. People from neighboring towns and villages, hearing of the commotion time, as some called it, abandoned their fields and homes to join this burgeoning movement. Their meeting point, a grand old oak on the road between Windham and Hethersett, soon became a symbol, a silent witness to the birth of their resolve. This tree, later known as Kett's Oak, has stood the test of time, a living monument to a forgotten struggle. The night of July 9th found Kett and his followers camping at Bowthorpe, just west of Norwich. The city authorities, understandably alarmed, sent their representatives. First a local official, perhaps Nicholas Lestrange, the sheriff of Norfolk and Suffolk, or Sir Edmund Windham, a former sheriff. Their message was simple: disperse. Their reception, however, was anything but simple. The rebels, now confident in their numbers and their cause, refused. The official, faced with this sea of determined faces, had no choice but to retreat to Norwich, his pleas unheard. Next came the mayor of Norwich himself, Thomas Codd, a man of considerable influence. He too met with the rebels, hoping to de-escalate the situation, to reason with them. But the tide of rebellion was too strong. His efforts proved futile, and he too returned to the city, leaving Kett's growing army camped at Eaton Wood for the next night. The following day, their intention was clear: to march through Norwich to reach Mousehold Heath, a strategic high ground to the northeast of the city. Permission was predictably denied, so the rebels adapted. They crossed the river Wonsum at Helsden, a testament to their unwavering determination, and spent the night at Drayton. Finally, on Friday, July 12th, the rebel army reached Mousehold Heath. This was more than just a campsite. It was a carefully chosen vantage point. From here, they could look down upon Norwich, a city that represented everything they were rebelling against. This strategic location would serve as their base for the next 6.5 weeks, a testament to the scale and duration of their defiance. The rebels themselves were now commonly referred to as the campmen, and the entire uprising as the camping time, or, more ominously, the commotion time. Kett, ever the pragmatist, established his headquarters within the ruins of St. Michael's Chapel, a place now famously known as Kett's Castle. Nearby, Mount Surrey, a grand house once owned by the ill-fated Earl of Surrey and now lying empty, served a new, grim purpose: a holding pen for Kett's prisoners, members of the gentry who had found themselves on the wrong side of this popular uprising. Under another ancient oak, the Oak of Reformation, as it came to be known, Kett's council met. This was no unruly mob. It was a surprisingly organized body, with representatives from the various hundreds of Norfolk and even one from Suffolk. From this natural chamber, they issued warrants, not unlike a legitimate government, to obtain provisions, secure arms, and, crucially, to arrest members of the gentry who resisted their demands. The camp itself was a marvel of popular mobilization. Workers and artisans from Norwich, peasants from the surrounding towns and villages, they all flocked to Mousehold. Soon, this rebel encampment became larger than Norwich itself, a city that, with its population of around 12,000, was then the second largest in England. The city authorities, now in a precarious position, sent urgent messages to London, but continued to negotiate with the rebels. Mayor Thomas Codd, even former Mayor Thomas Aldrich, and a local preacher named Robert Watson, accepted Kett's invitation to participate in their council, a clear indication of the rebels' growing power and the city's desperate attempts to maintain some semblance of peace. It was from this strategic position on Mousehold Heath that the rebels formalized their grievances. They drew up a list of 29 demands, a meticulously crafted document signed by Kett, Codd, Aldrich, and the representatives of the hundreds, and dispatched it to Protector Somerset in London. This wasn't merely a shopping list, as some historians have called it. It was a deeply logical articulation of their desire to curb the gentry's power, to safeguard village life, to resist rapid economic shifts, to protect communal resources, and, perhaps most profoundly, to reshape the moral values of the clergy. While they continued their practical acts of defiance, tearing down hedges and filling in ditches, only one of their 29 articles directly addressed the issue of enclosure. They requested that existing enclosures for saffron grounds be exempt, as these were costly to maintain, but that no new enclosures be permitted. The exemption for saffron grounds has puzzled historians, with some suggesting a scribal error for sovereign grounds, while others emphasize the local importance of saffron cultivation. Perhaps one of the most poignant demands in their list was a plea for the freedom of all bondmen, arguing that God made all free with his precious blood shedding. This was a direct challenge to the oppressive vagrancy laws of the time, particularly the 1547 Act for the Punishment of Vagabonds, which allowed for the enslavement of those who couldn't find new masters. It also spoke to the deeply held belief that the vast numbers of English serfs should be granted their freedom, a radical proposition for the age. Their demands didn't stop there. They called for a reduction in rents, the punishment of corrupt officials, and, most audaciously, the replacement of the king's counselors, both clerical and lay, who, in their view, were enriching themselves at the expense of the state. This was a thinly veiled attack on Protector Somerset's Regency Council itself. Even their religious practices reflected their radical spirit, as they used the new prayer book for their open-air services and called for the replacement of parish priests who failed to adequately set forth the word of God to their parishioners. This was not just an economic rebellion. It was a social and even theological uprising. The fragile truce between the city and the camp was finally shattered on July 21st. York Herald Bartholomew Butler, a messenger from the King's Council, arrived from London. He went with city officials to Mousehold, and there, in a moment that sealed the rebels' fate, he proclaimed the gathering a rebellion and offered a royal pardon. Kett's response was immediate and defiant. He rejected the offer, stating unequivocally that he had no need of a pardon, for he had committed no treason. With Kett's rejection, the rebels were now officially deemed outlaws. The York Herald, lacking the forces to arrest such a large assembly, retreated to Norwich with the mayor. The city gates were immediately shut, and preparations for defense began in earnest. The atmosphere in Norwich was undoubtedly tense, a mixture of fear and determination as they braced for the inevitable. On July 22nd, 1549, Kett, ever the pragmatist, proposed a truce, perhaps hoping to avoid bloodshed. But the city authorities, now emboldened by the king's declaration, rejected his offer. The rebels, left with no other option, launched their attack. They charged down from Mousehold, a torrent of humanity, and began swimming the Wonsum between the Cow Tower and Bishopsgate. The city defenders fired volleys of arrows into the crossing rebels, but it was a futile effort against such a determined onslaught. Norwich, England's second-largest city, quickly fell to the rebel army. Once inside, the rebels demonstrated their organization, capturing guns and other military supplies and establishing guards at strategic points. The York Herald, witnessing the fall of the city, made a second desperate offer of pardon. Again, it was rejected. The Herald, his mission a complete failure, departed for London, leaving an astonished England's second city in the hands of a peasant army. Remarkably, there was no random violence, no indiscriminate looting. Instead, the civic leaders were taken to Mousehold and imprisoned in Surrey House, the same place used to hold the gentry earlier. Mayor Codd, perhaps due to his earlier negotiations, was released and remained in the rebel camp, while his deputy, Augustine Stewart, stayed in the city to manage affairs. This was not a mindless rampage. It was a calculated takeover, aimed at asserting their control and demanding justice. News of Norwich's fall sent shockwaves through the royal court. King Edward VI, still a young boy, relied on his protector, Somerset, to manage the crisis. The first response was swift, but ultimately inadequate. The Marquis of Northampton, leading a force of about 1,400 men, including Italian mercenaries, was dispatched to quell the rebellion. As Northampton's army neared the city, he sent his herald forward, demanding the city's surrender. Deputy Mayor Augustine Stewart, after consulting with Mayor Codd, who was still on Mousehold, opened the city gates to Northampton's forces. The rebels, with Kett's foresight, had wisely withdrawn back to the safety of the high ground overlooking the city. Kett understood the difficulty of defending miles of walls and gates against a trained army. It was far more prudent, he reasoned, to allow Northampton's smaller force to occupy the city, while he, Kett, laid siege to it once again. The night of July 31st was a restless one in Norwich. The royal army made its defensive preparations, patrolling the city's narrow, winding streets. Around midnight, alarms rang out, startling Northampton from his sleep. Hundreds of rebels, intimately familiar with the labyrinthine network of small streets and alleys around Tombland, were launching hit-and-run attacks on the royal troops. For 3 grueling hours, Northampton's men fought in the darkness, eventually driving off the rebels, but suffering heavy casualties in the process. By 8 a.m. the following morning, August 1st, the ramparts between the Cow Tower and Bishopsgate were strengthened, providing some measure of security. Lord Sheffield, a nobleman fighting with Northampton, retired to the Maid's Head Inn for a much-needed breakfast. Shortly after, Northampton received intelligence that the rebels wished to discuss surrender and were gathering around the Pockthorpe Gate. Sheffield, eager for a peaceful resolution, went with the herald to investigate this seemingly positive turn of events. But it was a ruse. Upon arrival, Sheffield found no rebels at all. It was either a false rumor or, more likely, a brilliant diversion. At that very moment, thousands of rebels were once again crossing the river, Wonsum around Bishopsgate, launching a fresh assault. Northampton's main force was positioned in the marketplace. As the attack unfolded, he frantically fed men through the streets, desperately trying to contain a growing and vicious street battle that now raged across the entire eastern area of the city. Seeing the tide turning in the rebels' favor, Lord Sheffield took command of a body of cavalry and bravely charged the rebels across the cathedral precinct, past St. Martin at Place Church, and into Bishopsgate Street. It was there, outside the great hospital in Bishopsgate Street, that tragedy struck. Sheffield fell from his horse, tumbling into a ditch. Expecting to be captured and ransomed, as was the custom of the time, he removed his helmet. But these were not knights on a battlefield. These were desperate peasants fighting for their lives and their rights. Before he could react, Sheffield was struck down by a rebel, reputedly a butcher named Fulk. The loss of a senior commander, combined with his army being fragmented and overwhelmed in the chaotic street fighting, forced Northampton's hand. He issued the order for a full retreat. The king's first attempt to crush Kett's rebellion had failed, spectacularly and humiliatingly. Norwich, for a second time, was firmly in rebel hands. The message to London was clear. This was no minor skirmish. A more formidable force was needed. And so, the Earl of Warwick, a seasoned military leader with a strong reputation, was dispatched with a much larger army, around 14,000 men, including mercenaries from Wales, Germany, and Spain. Warwick had extensive experience from campaigns in France and was a prominent figure in the Privy Council, making him a formidable opponent. Despite this increased threat, the rebels, remarkably, remained loyal to Kett. Their resolve was unwavering, and they continued to fight Warwick's men with fierce determination. Northampton, eager to redeem himself, served as Warwick's second-in-command in this second, much larger, attempt to quell the uprising. Warwick managed to enter the city on August 24th, forcing his way through the St. Stephen's and Brazen Gates. The rebels, ever adaptable, retreated through the city, setting fire to houses as they went. This scorched-earth tactic was designed to slow the royal army's advance, turning Norwich into a burning maze. Around 3 p.m., Warwick's baggage train, carrying vital supplies and, crucially, all the artillery, entered the city. But in the chaos of the burning streets, it went astray. Instead of halting in the marketplace as intended, it continued through Tombland and straight down Bishopsgate Street, directly towards the rebel army. A group of rebels, spotting the vulnerable train from Mousehold, surged down into the city, seizing the opportunity to capture the valuable supplies. Captain Drury, one of Warwick's commanders, desperately led his men in an attempt to recapture the train. In yet another fierce fight around Bishopsgate, he managed to salvage some of the guns, but the engagement highlighted the rebels' tenacity and their willingness to seize any advantage. On August 25th, the rebels launched an artillery attack on the walls around the northern area of the city, near the Magdalen and Pockthorpe gates. With the north of the city once again in rebel hands, Warwick was forced to launch another full-scale assault. Bitter street fighting ensued, a brutal house-to-house struggle that eventually cleared the city once more. Norwich was retaken, but at a heavy cost, a testament to the ferocity of the rebellion. The tide, however, was about to turn decisively. On August 26th, 1,400 foreign mercenaries, German Landsknechts, a fearsome combination of handgunners and pikemen, arrived in the city. With these reinforcements, Warwick now commanded a truly formidable army, equipped and trained for open battle. Kett and his people were acutely aware of this shift in power. That night, they made a critical decision. They abandoned their entrenched camp at Mousehold, descending to lower ground in preparation for a pitched battle. During the morning of August 27th, the armies finally faced each other outside the city. The final, bloody confrontation took place at Dussindale. It was a disaster for the rebels. In the open against well-armed, disciplined, and professionally trained troops, they were routed. The thousands who had rallied behind Kett, fighting with courage and conviction, were massacred. Thousands were killed, their dream of a more just society crushed under the weight of royal power. The precise location of Dussindale has remained a subject of historical debate, but modern archaeological analysis, particularly the discovery of musket balls and other lead shot, suggests Long Valley, an area now partly built up to the northeast of Norwich city centre. Other research points to a location further east, near Great Plumstead. Regardless of the exact coordinates, the name Dussindale will forever be synonymous with the tragic end of Kett's rebellion. The aftermath was grim. An estimated 3,000 rebels lay dead at Dussindale, while Warwick's army lost a comparatively small 250 men. The morning after the battle, August 28th, executions began. Rebels were hanged at the Oak of Reformation, the same tree where their council had once met, and outside the Magdalen Gate. Estimates of the numbers vary, from 30 to a horrifying 300. Warwick had already executed 49 rebels when he had entered Norwich days before. There is only one attested incident of the rebels themselves committing cold-blooded murder. one of Northampton's Italian mercenaries, was hanged after his capture. The scale of the royal retribution was stark, a brutal warning against future defiance. Robert Kett, the unlikely leader, was captured at the village of Swannington the night after the battle, along with his brother William. He was taken to the Tower of London to face trial for treason. Found guilty, the brothers were returned to Norwich in early December. On December 7th, 1549, Kett was hanged from the walls of Norwich Castle, a stark and public execution designed to deter any lingering thoughts of rebellion. On the very same day, his brother William was hanged from the West Tower of Windham Abbey, a chilling end for the two men who dared to challenge the established order. The legacy of Kett's rebellion was, for a long time, one of condemnation. In 1550, the Norwich authorities decreed that August 27th should be an annual holiday, commemorating the deliverance of the city from the rebellion. Lectures were commissioned in the cathedral and parish churches, emphasizing the grave sins of rebellion, a tradition that continued for over a century. Early accounts, like Nicholas Southerton's eyewitness report and Alexander Neville's 1575 Latin history, were openly hostile to the rebels, painting them as dangerous fanatics. Neville's work, translated into English as Norfolk Furies, was reprinted throughout the 17th century, shaping the popular perception of Kett as a traitor. It wasn't until the 19th century that more sympathetic portrayals began to emerge. Anonymous works critical of Neville's account appeared, and in 1859, clergyman Frederick Russell, unearthing new archival material, concluded that though Kett is commonly considered a rebel, yet the cause he advocated is so just that one cannot but feel he deserved a better name and a better fate. This marked a turning point, transforming Kett from a despised traitor to a complex, even heroic, figure in local folklore. In 1948, Alderman Fred Henderson, a former mayor of Norwich who had himself been imprisoned for his part in the food riots of 1885, proposed a memorial to Kett. Though his initial hope for a statue was not realized, a plaque bearing his words was unveiled on the walls of Norwich Castle in 1949, for 100 years after the rebellion. Even in the 21st century, the memory of Kett and his rebellion persists. On December 7, 2011, the anniversary of his death, a memorial march took place in Norwich, and a wreath was laid by the gates of Norwich Castle, a quiet act of remembrance for a man who died fighting for justice. The Kett family, despite the forfeiture of their lands after the rebellion, surprisingly managed to prosper in various parts of Norfolk in the longer term. The rebellion itself is now commemorated in local names, schools, streets, pubs, and even a walking route bear Kett's name. There's the Robert Kett Junior School in Windham, Dussindale Primary School in Norwich, the Robert Kett Pub, Kett House at the University of East Anglia, and Kett's Tavern in Norwich. A folk band, Lewis Garland and Kett's Rebellion, and a local beer, Kett's Rebellion by Woodford's Brewery, further solidify his place in local culture. Kett's Rebellion has also inspired numerous works of fiction, from 19th century novels like Frederick H. Moore's Mistress Hazelwood to more contemporary works such as C.J. Sansom's Tombland. Plays, poetry, and even a 1988 overture by British composer Malcolm Arnold bear witness to the enduring power of this story. The story of Robert Kett and the fall of Norwich is not just a tale of rebellion and defeat. It is a powerful reminder of the resilience of ordinary people, their capacity for organization, and their unwavering belief in justice, even when faced with overwhelming odds. It is a story of a city under siege, not by foreign invaders, but by its own people demanding a fairer world. It is a chapter in history that speaks volumes about the tumultuous 16th century and the enduring human quest for dignity and freedom. And it serves as a powerful echo, reminding us that even in the most rigid of social structures, the fire of protest can ignite, and for a brief, glorious moment, even a peasant army can bring a mighty city to its knees. So, the dreams of a fairer England, born under the leafy canopy of the Oak of Reformation, were about to face the unforgiving steel of the crown. The game, for Robert Kett and his burgeoning army, was no longer one of strategic siege and negotiated peace. The time for parley had passed, and the drums of war were now beating a relentless rhythm across the fields of Norfolk. Warwick, a man forged in the crucible of continental warfare, was not one to underestimate. He had seen too much blood and heard too many cries of rebellion to treat this uprising with anything less than brutal efficiency. His initial entry into Norwich on August 24th was a calculated display of force, striking at the very gates the rebels had so confidently held. But even Warwick, with his hardened mercenaries and seasoned troops, found himself ensnared in the labyrinthine streets of Norwich. The rebels, though outmatched in arms and training, fought with a desperate ferocity, setting fire to houses, turning every alley into a choke point, every street into a battlefield. It was urban warfare at its most raw, a testament to the rebels' ingenuity and their unwavering commitment to their cause. The city, once a prize, became a burning trap for both sides. Can you imagine the chaos? The smoke choking the narrow lanes, the crackle of burning timbers, the screams of men, and the incessant clang of steel on steel. Warwick's baggage train, carrying vital artillery, somehow got lost in this inferno, a testament to the sheer confusion of the fighting. A critical blunder, seized upon by the rebels who poured down from Mousehold Heath like a wave, intent on capturing these precious supplies. Captain Drury, a man of quick wit and courage, managed to salvage some of the guns in yet another ferocious skirmish around Bishopsgate. It was a close call, a moment where the tide could have turned, but fate, it seems, was not on the rebels' side. The following day, August 25th, saw the rebels, emboldened by their partial success and their unwavering spirit, launch an artillery attack on the northern walls of the city. The audacity of it, a peasant army bringing cannons to bear against the king's men. For a brief, exhilarating moment, the north of the city was once again in rebel hands. But Warwick, ever the strategist, would not tolerate such insolence. He unleashed his forces, and the bitter street fighting resumed, eventually, inevitably, clearing the city once more. Yet, despite these brutal engagements, the decisive blow was yet to come. On August 26th, a chilling new element arrived in Norwich. 1,400 German Landsknechts. These are no ordinary foot soldiers. These were professional mercenaries, a terrifying mix of handgunners and pikemen, renowned for their discipline and their ruthlessness. With these reinforcements, Warwick's army transformed into a truly formidable force, an engine of destruction poised to crush the rebellion once and for all. Kett and his council, gathered under the dwindling shade of the Reformation Oak, understood the gravity of the situation. They knew their position on Mousehold Heath, though advantageous for overseeing the city, would be a death trap against such a concentrated and disciplined army. They decided to descend from the high ground, to meet Warwick's forces on lower terrain, to fight a pitched battle. It was a desperate gamble, a last throw of the dice, but perhaps the only choice they felt they had. To remain on the heath was to be encircled, starved out, and eventually slaughtered. To fight in the open, however suicidal it might seem, offered a slim, vanishing hope of victory. And so, on the morning of August 27th, 1549, the two armies faced each other outside the city. The air would have been thick with the smell of damp earth and the nervous sweat of thousands of men. The clatter of armor, the guttural commands of officers, the murmured prayers of the rebels, all would have mingled in a cacophony of dread and anticipation. The final battle, the crushing of the dream, took place at a location known as Dussindale. In the open fields of Dussindale, the stark reality of the situation became brutally clear. The rebels, though outnumbering Warwick's forces, were no match for the professional soldiers, their superior weaponry, and their disciplined tactics. Against well-armed and rigorously trained troops, the raw courage of the peasants was simply not enough. The Landsknechts, with their long pikes and devastating handguns, cut through the rebel lines like a scythe through ripe wheat. The battle was a rout, a massacre. Thousands were killed, their bodies strewn across the fields, their dreams of a just England extinguished in a torrent of blood. Estimates suggest around 3,000 rebels perished at Dussindale. Think of that number for a moment. 3,000 men, fathers, sons, brothers, all cut down for daring to challenge the established order. Warwick's army, by contrast, suffered a mere 250 casualties. The disparity speaks volumes about the brutal efficiency of the Crown's response. The morning after the battle, the retribution began. Rebels were hanged at the very Oak of Reformation, a symbolic gesture of the utter defeat of their cause, and outside the Magdalen Gate. The numbers vary, but somewhere between 30 and 300 men met their end on the gallows. Warwick had already executed 49 rebels when he first entered Norwich, a stark warning that had gone unheeded. It's worth noting that in all the chaos, the rebels themselves are only attested to have killed in cold blood on one occasion, hanging an Italian mercenary of Northampton's. The Crown's response, however, was far less constrained by such niceties. Robert Kett, the yeoman who had dared to lead this monumental uprising, was captured the night after the battle in the village of Swannington. Along with his brother William, he was taken to the Tower of London to face trial for treason. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. Found guilty, the brothers were returned to Norwich at the beginning of December. On December 7th, 1549, Kett was hanged from the walls of Norwich Castle, a chilling spectacle meant to serve as a permanent deterrent. On the very same day, his brother William was hanged from the West Tower of Windham Abbey, his execution a stark echo of Robert's fate, a final, brutal message that rebellion would not be tolerated. The immediate aftermath was one of severe suppression and an attempt to erase the memory of the uprising. In 1550, the Norwich authorities decreed that August 27th, the day of the rebels' defeat, would henceforth be a holiday commemorating the deliverance of the city from Kett's rebellion. Lectures were commissioned in cathedrals and parish churches, sermonizing on the terrible sins of rebellion. This tradition, a deliberate act of historical revisionism, continued for over a century, painting Kett and his followers as dangerous traitors. Early accounts of the rebellion, such as Nicholas Southerton's eyewitness manuscript, were predictably hostile towards the rebels. Alexander Neville's 1575 Latin history, De Furoribus Norfolciensium, translated in 1615 as Norfolk Furies, became the dominant narrative, portraying the rebels as a mindless, violent mob. Even Francis Blomfield's detailed 18th century account, while acknowledging the rebels' grievances, ultimately heaped abuse upon them. For centuries, Kett was simply a traitor, his name synonymous with unrest and disorder. But history, as we know, is rarely static. The seeds of discontent, though buried under layers of official narratives, can sometimes re-emerge, re-evaluated, and reinterpreted. It wasn't until the 19th century that more sympathetic portrayals of Kett's rebellion began to surface. Clergyman Frederick Russell, through diligent archival research, concluded that though Kett is commonly considered a rebel, yet the cause he advocated is so just that one cannot but feel he deserved a better name and a better fate. This was a turning point, the beginning of Kett's slow transformation from traitor to folk hero. In the 20th century, the process accelerated. In 1948, Alderman Fred Henderson, a former mayor of Norwich with his own history of activism, campaigned for a memorial to Kett. Though a statue proved too controversial, a plaque was eventually unveiled on the walls of Norwich Castle in 1949 for 100 years after the rebellion. It bears his words, a testament to the enduring power of Kett's struggle. Even in the 21st century, the memory of Robert Kett and his rebellion is kept alive. On December 7th, the anniversary of his execution, memorial marches and wreath-laying ceremonies continue to take place by the gates of Norwich Castle, a defiant gesture against centuries of official condemnation. The Kett family, surprisingly, did not suffer unduly in the long term. While Robert and William's lands were forfeited, some were later restored to Robert's son. Indeed, the Kett family appears to have prospered in various parts of Norfolk, a testament to their resilience and, perhaps, a quiet acknowledgement that the rebellion's grievances were not entirely forgotten. Today, The legacy of Kett's rebellion echoes in the names of schools, streets, pubs, and even a walking route in the Norwich and Windham area. The Robert Kett Junior School, Dussindale Primary School, the Robert Kett Pub, Kett House at the University of East Anglia, and Kett's Tavern in Norwich all serve as tangible reminders of this pivotal moment in English history. A folk band, Lewis Garland and Kett's Rebellion, and a local beer named Kett's Rebellion by Woodford's Brewery further cement his place in the local consciousness. The Rebellion has also inspired novels, plays, and poetry, including C.J. Sansom's popular historical novel, Tombland. Even British composer Malcolm Arnold produced the Robert Kett Overture in 1988, a powerful musical tribute to the uprising. The story of Kett's Rebellion is a testament to the enduring human desire for fairness, justice, and a voice in one's own destiny. It's a story of courage, sacrifice, and the brutal realities of power. While the immediate outcome was defeat and death, the long-term echoes of Kett's struggle continued to reverberate through the centuries, a constant reminder that even the most powerful of rulers ignore the cries of their people at their peril. The dream, though crushed on the fields of Dussindale, never truly died. It merely retreated, waiting for another generation, another moment to rise again. And that, my friends, is why we remember Robert Kett and the Great Commotion time of 1549. And so, our journey through the tumult of Kett's rebellion draws to a close. We've witnessed the desperate cries for justice, the audacious spirit of ordinary people, and the brutal power of a kingdom determined to maintain its order. The echoes of these events still resonate, reminding us of the enduring human struggle. Thank you for spending this time with Vibing History. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please consider liking this video, sharing it, and of course, following for more explorations into our shared past. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below and what forgotten tales you'd like us to unearth next. Until then, stay curious, and may history continue to speak to you.